For today's lesson, we're going to be looking at An African Thunderstorm by David Rubadiri. The poet was born in Malawi in 1930, and he is seen as a postmodern colonial African poet. It is important for us to note the issue of context when we are dealing with poetry. This one, as we could see from the title, is a very specific African context. At first glance, if we look at the poem, we can see that it has 4 stanzas. But what I want you to note is that the stanzas have an irregular amount of lines in each one. Later on, we will unpack this and look at exactly what the poet was trying to do. If we look at the title of the poem, it is very clear as to the setting of the poem, which is in Africa. But secondly, we need to look at the idea of a thunderstorm. Now, thunderstorms we might think are everywhere, they are a normal occurrence in life. But thunderstorms are storms which are very particular to Africa. And what I want you to think about is how particular this weather occurrence actually is, and why the poet would want to write about something that is very close to his heart and something that is obviously a rare occurrence for other people. If we look at stanza 1, we can note in line 1 that we have an example of a metaphor. We see that the poet starts out the poem by saying that the storm that we are going to experience is coming from the west. Now, if we look at the west, we know that it has negative connotations and possibly connotations of colonization. In lines 2 and 3, we see that there is a lot of movement created by the poet, in the sense that he uses the words hurrying as well as turning sharply. We see that this is a very specific type of storm. It is a bit erratic, and therefore we need to think about what could this mean. If we look at the nature of the storm, we can see that it is clearly one that could be very destructive. We see the issue of it hurrying, we see it turning sharply, we then see it going here and there. And then in line 5, the poet uses a simile where he says, like a plague of locusts. Now, the issue of the plague takes us back to a biblical allusion of destruction that took place during biblical times. In lines 7 and 8, we have an example of a simile. And what we need to note here is that the storm is being compared to a madman. Now, I want you to think for a few minutes of your possible experience of somebody who's not quite all there and how they would be interacting with things that they can't possibly see. And this is exactly what the storm is like. If you can imagine the storm going from left to right, here and there, as he says in line 4, but there is no real thing that the storm is chasing after. So the storm is very destructive, but also it seems to have a very uncharacteristic thought process. There is no direct plan. We don't know exactly where the storm is going to go. In the first 3 lines of the stanza, we can see that there is an example of personification. Here, it suggests that the weight of the water is about to be released onto the land. And what we also need to note is that the clouds are riding stately. There is an element of superiority. There is an element of importance of these clouds. In line 12, there is an example of a simile. And the poem says that the clouds are sitting like sinister, dark wings. Now, if you think of the image of the cloud, firstly, in it being pregnant, we could imagine that they are very large, but also if we think of them as being sinister and dark, they are most likely very dark clouds, which has an element of them being very ominous. However, what I want you to note is that in the first image of them being pregnant, there is a positive connotation in that respect. So it's not as if these clouds are just purely destructive, but they do have an element of being destructive. In line 13, there is an example of an onomatopoeia. And line 13 and 14 show us an example of a metaphor. Here we see the power and the great nature of the storm. We see that the trees are bending just because of the wind of the storm. So the storm has great power, as we have seen from stanza 1 as well as stanza 2. But if we look at the example of them bending, it's almost as if the trees are bowing down to the storm. They understand the power of the storm and they are willing to bow down to the storm itself. At the beginning of stanza 3, there is a very precious moment that we see between the storm and the small kids. And I can assume that all of us have played in the rain at some point in our lives. And this is that exact scenario. The children are screaming with delight and they are clearly enjoying the sounds, the excitement that is created by the storm and the wind that comes with it. In this stanza, I want you to note the fast pace of the stanza. And how that is created is the poet uses very short lines that cause us to move very quickly from line to line. And this is possibly in relation to the speed at which the storm is picking up. So what he does is in relation to the content. So when you are going through exam papers, you're going to note that a lot of questions will ask you about form and content. And this is a perfect example because the form of the stanza, i.e. the short lines, is clearly in relation to its contents, i.e. the speed of the storm itself. In line 26, we have an example of a simile. Here we see that the clothes are being compared to tattered flags. In line 28, we then see the destruction of the storm and its wind. It exposes the dangling breasts of the woman that it comes across. And if we look at the woman and their breasts, we can see that the storm is exposing prized possessions of the woman. The last 3 lines of the stanza create an image of an army or of soldiers. Now, if we look at the last line, it says, "and the pelting march of the storm," which is an example of personification. And here we can see that the storm is being compared to the march of a soldier. And that is a very clear image of how we have seen the storm. The storm has constantly been approaching us throughout the poem. And now as it gets closer, we hear greater sounds, we see more destruction, and we therefore can assume that at some point it will come to land and the storm will explode and the clouds will explode. But for now, as we note, the storm breaks up and possibly will get to land later on. The poem is divided into 2 parts, which divide the content into the general and the specific. The first part make up stanzas 1 and 2, which describe the storm as it gathers momentum, and the 3rd and 4th stanza describe its impact on human existence. The tone of this poem can be seen as ominous. This is because of the diction in terms of the word plague, madman, dark, sinister, madly, jagged, blinding, rumble, tremble, and crack. All of these words contribute to the idea of an ominous tone. They also then create an uncomfortable mood. And the uncomfortable mood contributes to the idea of the storm as a metaphor. The storm then can be seen to symbolize the destruction caused by colonialism. The storm comes like a plague of locusts, which causes starvation and tears off the women's clothing, taking the little that they have. The short, uneven lines, especially in stanza 3, help create a mood of chaos and destruction. The literal meaning of the poem focuses on the chaos and destruction of a storm and the helplessness of the people caught in its path. The storm can also be seen as a metaphor. It could imply the British and European colonialism and the destructive impact that it had on the people of Africa. Thank you for attending today's lesson. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe down below so that you can attend the next one. Thanks. Bye.